These are some of the greats, not just icons amongst their peers from Munich, but legends that are fit to rub arches with the greatest drivers' cars of all time. It must be intimidating knowing that you have to follow in their tyre tracks, but that's exactly what this BMW has to do. It's the new G82 M4 Competition. With 503 brake horsepower and 479 pounds-foot of torque from its new S58 closed-deck twin-turbo 3-litre straight 6, it certainly has some muscle. But it also weighs a hefty 1,725 kilos. What's more, in the UK it is only available with an automatic gearbox, not a DCT, an actual torque converter auto. And then there is the grille, which is bold. So, on paper, it's not looking great for this latest generation.
Thankfully, we don't drive on paper. This is fantastic. For all of that extra weight, it just doesn't feel it. As soon as you turn the wheel, you can feel the lateral stiffness. The steering's not completely wriggling with feel, but the accuracy that you have around it is phenomenal. It feels like an M car from the moment you're in it.
The fundamental structure of the latest 4 Series was clearly a good start, but BMW has put in a lot of work to stiffen it further. Open the bonnet and you can see some of the extra bracing. Hardly the lovely carbon horseshoe of old, is it? But this is just the tip of the bracing iceberg. Combined with the M-specific suspension, it's certainly effective, giving you a phenomenal sense of connection and therefore confidence from behind the wheel.
There's just a lovely tautness to it, and then you get to the engine, this S58 engine, and it's turbocharged, but it is so linear and so responsive. It's a match for the chassis. It is disappointing in that it doesn't sound brilliant. It's sort of gruff. There is some BMW to the note in it, but the main thing is just the way it's so creamy smooth all the way up to its red line. And of course, with 503 brake horsepower and best part of 500 pounds-foot of torque, it shrugs off any extra weight, I can tell you that much. It's not a real sort of crescendo, which I suppose you wouldn't really expect with a turbo engine anyway, but if we're going to be picky, that's not there. That's not perhaps the real spine-tingling nature of the very best M engines, but in terms of what it delivers, absolutely no complaints at all. Then there's the gearbox, and obviously I really did have my doubts. It was possibly my biggest doubt actually about this car. How could they put an 8-speed torque converter in this and still make it an M car? And perhaps I do still have some misgivings about it, because I think an improved DCT, something like Porsche's PDK, would have made this car even better. Having said that, the shifts in this are so smooth that I actually think it's an improvement on the old DCT, which you were always just a bit nervous of, because it could dump shifts in a way that you always felt might just unsettle the rear axle, so you could feel a bit uneasy using that old DCT, whereas this, you just don't have any worries about it at all. Yes, again, right at the top end, perhaps it's a little bit soft, it doesn't quite have the snappiness, the precision that you would expect from an M car, but in terms of usability again, and actual just enjoyment down the road, I would rather have this than the old DCT.
The carbon paddles even feel quite nice. It's not the most satisfying action, but they are interestingly tactile on their red backs, with the dimples for down and pimples for up.
Whereas in the old DCT, which could just feel a bit like a automated single clutch manual, you'd never really turn it up to its full maximum attack speed in terms of changes. This, well, down here you can just put it up to 3 all the time, to be honest, and it's so smooth, even when it's giving the fast shifts, that it's absolutely fine. And of course, you can wind it all the way back, and it is a torque converter, so you can make it a nice relaxing everyday car, and it is that bit more relaxing. It's an everyday car.
Yes, there is quite a bit of road noise transmitted into this new M4, but the actual ride quality is impressive. You certainly feel the bumps, but never harshly, so it's not uncomfortable. And if you find yourself cruising on the motorway, heading to a multi-storey car park, then this latest M4 even has a whole suite of driver assistance systems to call upon, if you like relinquishing a bit of control.
Now, you can actually get a new M4 with a 6-speed manual gearbox, just not in the UK. It's the standard or non-competition M4. It's got 473 brake horsepower and 406 pounds-foot, so quite a bit down, particularly on the torque, because the 6-speed gearbox can't cope. But if you're lucky enough to live in one of those markets, you can get a 6-speed manual.
In the UK, the M4 Competition starts at £76,000. In terms of the spec on this particular car, well, the most eye-catching thing is certainly the Sao Paulo yellow paint, which is actually a no-cost option. These wheels, 19s at the front, 20s at the rear, are 826 M-style forged alloys, and if you want, they can be wrapped in Cup 2 tyres instead of this car's 4S rubber. The carbon roof with its new aerodynamic ridges is of course standard, but this car has some extra carbon at the front, on the wing mirrors, and round the back with the diffuser and the small spoiler. These are all part of the £6,750 M carbon pack, which also includes the seats, which we'll talk about in a moment. One carbon option not on this car is carbon ceramic brakes. I had no complaints with the standard items, although admittedly I didn't encounter any big alpine descents, but there may well be a benefit to be felt from the 15 kilos of unsprung mass saved with the golden calipered items, if you want to lash out.
Of course, the big option with this is that you can have it as an M3 competition. And the great thing about this is that it's basically exactly the same. It's the same overall length. It's obviously a little bit higher, so 40 millimeters higher. It's very slightly wider, it's 16 millimeters wider. Same 0 to 62 mile an hour time at 3.9 seconds, same 503 brake horsepower and 479 pounds-foot of torque. You obviously get the extra practicality of some rear doors, and you get a bit more boot space, so it's up to 480 litres, which is 40 litres more than the M4 Competition. I've actually driven this car, and really, to all intents and purposes, I can't see any real difference between this and the M4 Competition. I actually think this is better. For one crucial reason, you see the standard 3 Series is slightly narrower than the standard 4 Series. So because they've got the same width tracks, you just get a bit more rear arch, a bit more haunch, a bit more M-blistering, which I think looks really good.
Of course, we've been promised an M3 Touring in the future too, which could be the most desirable of the lot. And there will be X-Drive models that will send power to the front as well as the rear wheels. Anyway, back to the M4. Thank you. And time for a look at the interior.
In here, well, most of it is actually standard, so all this lovely carbon here and on the wheel, that's standard. The Harman Kardon stereo, that's standard. The head-up display, that's standard too. Something that is an option, well, these rather lovely M carbon bucket seats. They're part of the carbon pack. I think they're worth the money. Partly because they save a bit of weight, so 4.8 kilos per seat, but yeah, just under 10 kilos is not a huge saving in a car that weighs over 1,700 kilos. However, they just add to the ambience of this car. They're still electrically adjustable. There's this curious sort of carbon bit down here that sort of evokes the idea that they might be set up for 6-point harnesses. And then there are the grab handles on the side that remind me sort of a toboggan, you know, little plastic ones you can buy. They're even heated. I mean, what's not to like? Anyway, there are in here a lot of buttons, and I do like buttons as opposed to just all on a touchscreen, but I think to show you what they do, we should go back out on the road.
Let's start with the M Mode button, which gives you options of road, sport and track, essentially progressively reducing the distractions from the displays. In track it also turns off things like lane keep assist, which is a useful shortcut to know about. Next is the setup button, which brings up a mildly perplexing plethora of things for you to adjust, but for once they are actually all useful and usable.
So for engine and chassis we've got 3 options, and then steering and brakes we've got 2 options. And it might sound odd to say they're all usable, of course they should be, but sometimes in cars you feel like they're just being put there because the engineers can, and you're always hunting around for the sort of the Goldilocks setting, the sweet spot if you like. With this, steering, comfort, that makes sense. You use that around town or just daily driving. But sports, yes, actually it does make a difference. Just the extra added weight is nice when you're driving more quickly. Similarly with brakes. Comfort, sport. Every day when you're driving more quickly.
The engine settings are pretty self-explanatory too. Comfort renders the powertrain relatively docile, while Sport Plus responds like your average startled lizard.
I've actually been knocking it back to sport a lot of the time because I think on the road it just feels a little bit nicer. It just takes out some of the hyper-aggressiveness on the throttle. I think it really is mostly for track, that setting. Perhaps the biggest surprise for me came with the chassis options because, yes, Sport is probably the best on a bumpy road, but you can use Sport Plus, and I actually love the extra agility that you get with Sport Plus. Turn in and it's just instantly there. It seems to rotate so quickly and then lean on that outside rear tyre, so it's just there waiting to respond to the throttle. It is so much fun.
Yes, the damping is firm, but in no way does it feel like it wants to bounce you off the road like you might expect. It retains composure, and it's actually really impressive.
They've complicated the DSC settings too in this, so you've still got MDM or M Dynamic mode, which is a really nice halfway house. Then you've got DSC off, but you've also got 10 stages in that traction control, so you can tune it. If you do turn it all the way off, then it's amazing because for all this car's tautness and responsiveness, actually it's very progressive too. There is real polish to this car on the limit. It's a bit like, I don't know, it's a bit like a tennis player who's capable of smashing a serve down at 130 miles an hour, then sprinting to the net and then having incredibly soft hands just to volley it back.
This ease with which the suspension and MDiff combine makes all the chassis agility and the powertrain's aggression feel approachable. It makes the whole car feel fun.
One other small advantage actually of turning the DSC off, which I've noticed, is very, very subtle, but I think the steering is actually slightly nicer just with all the aids off. Something just seems to release it.
And of course, once you've worked out which settings you'll want access to most often, you can simply program the M1 and M2 buttons on the wheel. From its spec sheet, I was worried that this latest M4 would lean too much towards the everyday end of the spectrum, that there wouldn't be enough M for motorsport in it. But thankfully, that's not the case. For me, the handling actually continues the aggressive, pointy nose balance that started with the E92 M3 Coupe and continued through the F82. But in the G82, that distinctive, almost darty directness has more polish to its edges. Like it or loathe it, this grille deserves its place alongside its predecessors.
I really was sceptical about this car, but I love it. It's not completely fault-free, but it's a proper M car and it's fantastic to drive.